Hello, and welcome to today's lesson on Grade 11 Life Sciences. What we're going to be looking at in this lesson is we're going to be looking at biodiversity. The wide variety of weird and wonderful living things that exist on our Earth. To be able to make sense of this variety, scientists group or classify the organisms into different kingdoms, which you should have covered at the end of grade 10. Let's have a look at those kingdoms. There are 5 kingdoms. At the bottom, the most primitive organisms, they're so primitive they don't even have a nucleus, are the Monera or bacteria. Then we have the group Protista, which are tiny, but at least they have a nucleus. And then we have the fungi, which are multicellular. Now, what do scientists look at to divide the organisms into the different groups? So these are the same 5 groups, and in this picture there are some of the characteristics that scientists use to divide the organisms into groups. What are these characteristics? What do scientists look at? First of all, they say, do they have metabolism? Is something happening inside them? Do they have a nucleus? And you should have come across the terms prokaryotic for those that don't have a proper nucleus, or eukaryotic for those that do. Next, they look at, do they have a cell wall in which they are more plant-like, or do they have a membrane? In other words, are they more animal-like? Then, do they have organelles, which you learnt about when you talked about cells? Then, are they uni or multicellular? And are they autotrophic or heterotrophic? We are now going to look at the first group of microorganisms that we study, which are viruses. So let's look at viruses. They're very strange because they're actually not proper cells, and we call them acellular because they don't have cytoplasm, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have metabolism. The only thing they can do is reproduce, and they reproduce in other cells, and in doing so they cause damage. Now, this picture is the coronavirus, and in the coronavirus there is only this bit here, which is RNA. Apart from that, there's nothing much in the cell, and yet it causes such devastation. The next group we look at of microorganisms are the bacteria, which are put into the kingdom Monera. These at least are proper cells because they have a cytoplasm and cell wall, but they do not have a proper nucleus, and the term we use that is prokaryotic. How they get food, some of them are autotrophic, meaning they make their own food, and others are heterotrophic. Now, in class, you should have learnt the basic structure of a bacterial cell, which is what is being shown now. Some bacteria have DNA, other bacteria have RNA. What is interesting is this little thing here, which is called a plasmid, and that is a ring of DNA which is used when we do genetic engineering, which you will learn about in grade 12. The next group we're looking at of microorganisms are the slightly more advanced microorganisms called the kingdom Protista. These have proper cells. They've got cytoplasm and organelles, and they have a proper nucleus, so they are called eukaryotic. There's a huge variety of protists, some of them being plant-like, which means they have chlorophyll and cell walls, and you can see this picture shows some of the wide variety of different algae that we sometimes find in swimming pools and dams. Other protists are more animal-like, and in class you might have had to draw a picture of this little organism, which is an amoeba, and it moves around to find food. And that is a little green alga, which the amoeba is about to eat. Most protists are unicellular, but some of them, the cells kind of live together, mainly for protection, so they seem to be multicellular, but each cell lives independently. They all carry out their own functions, so they're not truly multicellular. The third kingdom of microorganisms is the kingdom fungi. Now, these are larger organisms because they are multicellular. They have cell walls, in other words, making them similar to plants, but they can't make their own food. They are heterotrophic, so they have to get food from elsewhere. And luckily for us, most of them are decomposers, even though some of them do attack humans and other animals. What we have had a look at so far is we've looked at the group Monera, which are the simple prokaryotic unicellular organisms. Then we looked at the kingdom Protista, which are still mainly unicellular. They are eukaryotic, they have a proper nucleus, and some of them are also a simple type of multicellular. Then we get to the larger group, which is the fungi, and the fungi are bigger, they're multicellular, they're also eukaryotic, but they cannot make their own food. Your brains are probably bursting, so let's take a break. Welcome back from your break. I hope your brains are refreshed because we are now going to start look at the two kingdoms that are slightly more difficult to understand. So let's go back to our original system of classification. So what we're looking at here is the classification system in which organisms are divided into 5 kingdoms. The reason why it's arranged like this is the kingdoms at the bottom. Those are the simplest kingdoms, those where the cells are least complicated, and right at the bottom here we have the most simple group of all, which is the Monera, which is where the bacteria fit. They are prokaryotic, they don't even have a proper nucleus. Now you will notice that viruses aren't on this scheme. And that is because there are many scientists who say, well, viruses aren't really alive because they don't have any metabolism. So that is why viruses are left off in this classification of living organisms, because they don't carry out many living functions. So conveniently, they're left out of this. The next group, which is slightly more complicated, is the Protists. And the reason why they are slightly more complicated is they are eukaryotic, meaning they have a proper nucleus. They've got a cytoplasm, they've got organelles, so they are proper cells as we know them. However, most of them are unicellular, and those that are multicellular kind of just live together and don't share any of the tasks of life. So even though they're termed multicellular, they're actually a simple version of multicellular. Then we looked at the fungi, which are all eukaryotic, and they're all multicellular. In other words, they're bigger, and that's why we can see many of them. They have some characteristics of plants. For example, they've got a cell wall. They have some characteristics of animals. For example, they are heterotrophic, which is why they're put into their own kingdom. What we're going to be looking at now is we're going to be looking at the remaining 2 kingdoms, which are the kingdoms that we're most familiar with and the kingdoms that we see around us every day. They're also the most complicated of the kingdoms and a little bit difficult to understand. So the kingdoms we're going to be looking at now, first of all, we're going to be looking at the plants, or the kingdom Plantae. Now, what makes a plant a plant? Let's have a look at the characteristics. First of all plants are multicellular and eukaryotic. In your study on cells, you would have realized that they have cell walls, and plants are green. They have chlorophyll and they are autotrophic. They can photosynthesize and make their own food. Of these green plants with cell walls, there are different degrees of differentiation. Some of them have tissues, some of them don't. Some of them have proper root stems and leaves, some of them don't. And in grade 10, you actually had a look at what root stems and leaves look like and what plant tissues actually look like. There are 4 phyla or groups in the plant kingdom, and the first one is the group Bryophytes. And these are the teensy-weensy little mosses that you find growing in damp corners on a rock. If you look at them under the microscope, you can see this is a microscopic view, and that would only be about 1 millimeter in size. So they are very, very tiny. What is important is that there is no differentiation. In other words, they don't have tissues. All the cells look basically the same. Because there are no tissues, they can't have proper roots, stems, or leaves. And that is why mosses are always so tiny, because they don't have proper leaves, they don't have proper stems, so they can't actually get water up to the top of the moss very, very efficiently, which is why they're always only about this size. Another feature about the mosses is that they reproduce in a simple way by means of spores. Now, spores are not a particularly effective way of reproducing. It works, but you have to produce a lot of spores to actually produce a few new moss plants. The next group of plants that we're looking at are called the pterophytes, and those are the ferns. And I'm sure you've all seen ferns, and they have got leaves. You can see their leaves, and if you dig them up, you can see they have roots, they have stems, they have leaves. So they're more like proper plants that we think of. And what is important is they are differentiated, meaning they have tissues. Now, tissues are very important because tissues enable the plant to survive, and especially xylem and phloem. And from your grade 10 work, you should remember that xylem is the tissue which transports water all over the plant. And that is why ferns can be much bigger than mosses, because they've got xylem to actually transport water all the way to the tips of the leaves. You would have had to look at, in class, you would have looked at the structure of a fern, and you would have seen they have roots, stems, and leaves. What differentiates them from many of the other plants in our gardens is they reproduce by means of spores. And that is not a particularly effective reproduction method. The next group we're looking at, hey, these guys are good, because they've got a much, much better way of reproducing, and those are the spermatophytes or seed plants. First of all, they are differentiated. In grade 10, you would have looked at the anatomy of plant roots, stems, and leaves, and it's the spermatophytes, or the seed-bearing plants that have the roots, stems, and leaves that you looked at in grade 10. They also have proper roots, stems, and leaves. And this is a very great advantage because leaves are specialized for photosynthesis, roots are specialized for absorbing water, and the presence of these means the plant has a better chance of survival. Another very important point, these guys reproduce by means of seeds, and seeds are a much more effective way of reproducing than spores ever were. All the work done in grade 10 on plant anatomy applies to the spermatophytes or the seed plants. But there are different groups of spermatophytes, so let's have a look at those. First group is the gymnosperms, and they produce seeds. They've got tissues, but the important thing is they produce seeds in cones. And the big problem with the gymnosperms is they rely on the weather for pollination to help the male get to the female. So if the weather doesn't play up, they're not going to be able to reproduce. The next group is quite clever. Those are the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, and they produce their seeds in flowers. And what flowers do, they don't all rely on the weather because they are beautiful and they attract pollinators. And that way they can ensure that reproduction occurs. The next group we're going to be having a look at are the animals. That's where we belong. Now, we're also eukaryotic, multicellular. We have to eat food. So we are different to plants. But there's a huge variety of different types of animals. So let's have a look at the characteristics that animals have. First of all, eukaryotic, multicellular, no cell walls. We learned that in grade 10. Heterotrophic, animals have to be because they can't make their own food. And similar to the plant kingdom, we find animal groups that have got very little differentiation and other animal groups that have got lots of differentiation. And remember, differentiation means you can have different tissues which can carry out different functions, all of which help keep you alive. So let's have a look at the animal kingdom. First of all, the simplest phylum in the animal kingdom is the Porifera, where there really isn't much differentiation. There's no tissues, there's no organs. It's basically just a blob. Very, very simple. The next group is a little bit more complex, and that's the phylum Cnidaria, where there is some differentiation. The cells are not all the same, but there aren't tissues. The cells don't work together, and therefore they can't have proper organs, because from your definition of organs, that's when different tissues work together to carry out a specific function. Then the next group is the Platyhelminthes, or the flatworm, and these are differentiated. So they do have different tissues. They actually have proper tissues, and they have an extra characteristic here because they have an extra tissue layer. And the fact that there's an extra tissue layer, a third tissue layer, means that they can have organs. And as we said, organs are very useful because they actually enable you to carry out all your life functions. Then the next group is the annelids, and they also have 3 tissue layers. You might have in class heard about a term called triploblastic, which means they've got a 3rd tissue layer. They have organs. Did you know that every segment inside an earthworm has got its own little kidney tubule in it? Sweet. Then they have another great advantage called a through gut, which means they can shovel food in at one end and the waste comes out at the other end, so they can eat all the time. Whereas the previous organisms we looked at had to eat food, digest it, and then spit their waste out their mouth, which is really not very hygienic. Another advantage that the annelids have is they have something called a coelom or a body cavity, which is very useful because it enables the digestive system to function independently of the body wall, plus it gives space for some of these organs to develop. Then the next group is the arthropods. And arthropods are the most numerous phylum on Earth. There are millions of different types of insects, and they're very successful. How often do you wish there weren't flies or there weren't cockroaches? But they're there. They're effective because they have got a blood system for transport. None of the other animals we've looked at have had blood. They have appendages for movement. They can run, they can fly. Their body is organized in a bilaterally symmetrical way, which enables them to move effectively. Think of a fly when you're trying to swat the fly. It can move. But what also enables the fly to move when you're trying to swat it, it can see you coming. And that is a key point. It's got sense organs and a teensy-weensy little bit of a brain. The last and most complex group is the group which you have studied a lot of in previous years of life science, and that is the vertebrates or the phylum Chordata. And we are very effective at survival because we've got a blood system, we've got appendages, legs and wings, which are very helpful. Our body is built on a left-right pattern, which enables us to move, and we have a brain. And different vertebrates have got different size brains. And humans have the biggest brain of all.